The following story I'm about to tell you is based off of a true story. In this story, there are two men, Fred and Jim. Fred and Jim both grew up together as childhood friends, and they went to the same elementary and high school. Right out of high school, Fred and Jim both get a job at the same company, and they get paid the same amount for their work. Down the line, Fred is forced to work until he is 70 and retires with only $60,000. Jim retires at 50 with a net worth of over $10 million. In this video, we're going to go over the factors that separated Jim and Fred as an example of the greater topic, which is what separates the rich from the poor, and what in the end determined one's success and the other's mediocrity. After the first month of work, Fred feels he has worked very hard at his job, and so when Fred's first paycheck finally comes in, Fred thinks he deserves to treat himself to a new gaming console. 1 month later, Fred's car breaks down, so he decides it's time to lease a brand new vehicle. Several years later, Fred has been saving his money up for a down payment on a house. Fred then buys a new house for himself that is bigger than he would ever need to live in with all of the money he has saved up. Jim, on the other hand, gets his paycheck, and after covering all of his expenses like food, rent, and his water and electricity bill, he then deposits the rest of his money into stocks and savings. Jim's car breaks down and is not worth fixing, so Jim buys a cheap used car with his savings, very similar to his last one. Jim now has saved up enough money to buy a house, so Jim purchases a house and lives in the top half of it and rents out the bottom half to a tenant who is paying off Jim's mortgage. Jim is paying himself first. This is what the rich do. Fred does not understand this concept, which is why he's buying liabilities like a new car, a new gaming console, and an unnecessarily large house for him to live in before he purchases any investments. Before Jim has purchased any liabilities, he has made sure that he has bought a significant amount of assets first. Jim and Fred are now back to work, and after another hard week at work, Fred again believes he deserves to reward himself, so he goes and plays with his new gaming console for the whole weekend. Jim, on the other hand, purchased a new book on real estate investing. He took his weekend to read that book. Jim and Fred go back to work, and Fred tells Jim about how it's so dumb he's still trying to learn and how he's wasting his money on books. Fred says how he finished learning the day he finished school. The difference here is that Jim is constantly learning and is investing in himself. Warren Buffett said that the best investment is always in yourself. The reason he said that is because a financial crisis could happen and both Jim and Fred could lose their jobs. But Jim will always have the knowledge he gained from reading, and no one can ever take that away from him. Fred and Jim are now both 30 years old. Fred has been doing the same thing for the past 10 years, working and then spending his free time and money on gaming, watching movies, and going to the bar. Jim, on the other hand, has spent his weekends building a small business that he is extremely passionate about. After spending time every weekend since he was 20 on his small business, Jim has now built it to a point where he can quit his job and pursue that business full time. 10 years ago, when Jim was first starting the business, Jim would put almost all the money he wasn't investing into his company. Fred would lecture Jim about how he's wasting all of his money on a business that will never work. Jim understood the principle of delayed gratification. There is a saying that goes, "Good things come to those who wait," and Jim was patient enough to see his vision through to the end and was rewarded by it by having the freedom to quit his job and work for himself on something he is extremely passionate about. This same thing happened when Jim bought another property to make it into a rental property. Fred lectured Jim about how he's wasting his money and how the property is only making Jim $100 a month and how it's not a good investment for the amount of money Jim had to put in. Jim held on to the property for 30 years, and it is now cash flowing Jim over $1,000 a month. It is also now appreciated in value to twice what it was worth when Jim initially purchased it. Fred tells Jim how doubling your money every 30 years isn't a good return on your investment. Jim is financially literate and tells Fred how he only put 5% down on the house, so his actual return is over 2,000%. Jim now has income coming in from his business, his rental properties, and his stocks. Jim has built his business to the point where it no longer needs him to physically be there for it to run. He has also done the same thing with his rental properties. Jim is now collecting $50,000 a month of passive income from all of his income streams, which means he does not need to do any work to receive that money. And now, at the age of 50, he decides he wants to retire and live off of his passive income. Fred is also 50, but is still working at the same job as he did 30 years ago, and will continue to do so for the next 20 years, only for him to retire with roughly $60,000 in the bank. For those next 20 years, Jim will be doing whatever he pleases, and Fred will be working at a job he hates. Jim understands that the rich do not rely on one single source of income. At Jim's retirement party, Jim and Fred discuss a time where they were trying to start a lemonade stand when they were kids. Fred said it wasn't their fault that no one bought their lemonade, and said that people should have bought it because they were just kids. Jim explained the story in a way that took responsibility, explaining how the stand sign was bad, the lemonade was very average, and how the stand was in a bad location. The difference between these two explanations is that Jim took responsibility and Fred blamed. This is because Jim has an internal locus of control, which means he believes his reality is a direct result of his actions, where Fred has an external locus of control, where he believes his actions don't directly determine his reality, and that things are just going to happen, and that there is nothing anyone can do about it. If you follow the 6 rules set out in this video, I guarantee it will set you on the path to financial freedom. Understanding the knowledge is easy, but taking action on that knowledge is the difficult part. I would just like to clarify before the video ends that I'm not saying that there's anything wrong between the different choices the poor make compared to the rich. I'm simply pointing out that those choices, in the end, determine one's financial wealth. I hope you got some value from this video, and if you did, the only thing that I ask is that you subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.